Hello and welcome to episode 2 of our series. Today we have an interesting one for you. It's something that still keeps me up at night. Hopefully, it won't keep you up. So please, come in, have a seat, take a drink, and relax. If you heard episode 1 of our series, then you know I was a contractor for a biopharmaceutical company in Southern California. I did so well in my duties that they wanted me to travel up north to San Francisco and help improve the site there. I only accepted the assignment as it came with a big pay raise. I did not know how long I was going to be up there, but I knew it wasn't indefinite. I didn't put my house up for sale, and I didn't make any plans of moving up there. I was originally going to stay in hotels and Airbnbs, but to my surprise, the cost of those hotels and Airbnbs were 4 times compared to my area. Even with my raise, I don't even think I could afford a mortgage up there. I'm not exaggerating when I say the cost of living is ridiculous. So, sadly, I ended up living out of my car a few days a week. I actually negotiated 3-day weekends so I could travel back south to my home and make sure it was maintained, and also for some personal reasons. The drive back and forth on weekends was about 5 hours, but it wasn't that bad. I actually enjoyed the time. I listened to Creepypastastories and it inspired me to make this series. Now to the story. See, to my surprise, a lot of people live out of their cars in the Bay Area. I mean, I just explained how expensive it is, but I promise it's much worse. At first, I was not sure where I could sleep. I figured the best places would be 24-hour spots. I assumed police wouldn't harass me there. I did 24-hour gyms, hospitals, grocery stores. I actually had a schedule to make sure I'd never stayed 2 days in the same parking lot, and with me occasionally staying in hotels, it wasn't that difficult. But eventually I got tired of this, so I did some research and found out that Walmart put out a statement saying that anyone can sleep in their parking lots and they won't be asked to leave. Well, I went and checked it out, and sure enough, that's where everybody was staying. I was taken back by how many people were living out of their cars. You could tell after Walmart would close. There were, of course, some abandoned cars, but the majority of the parking lot were just people sitting in their cars. Each of us staggered along the parking lot. No one really wanted to be next to each other. I saw it as a privacy thing, but also as a situation like that, you don't really want to talk to people about it. There were even campers that would show up every few months and stay there for a few weeks and then move on. I assume they did this because they didn't want to arouse suspicion. I always imagined Breaking Bad situations going on in the campers. Even though everyone was sprawled out, there was an unspoken rule that everyone had their own spot. Now, where I was parked, there were 3 cars closest to me. I of course took notice of my neighbors, but never bothered them. The saddest had to be this old man in an old 90s car, his back seat filled with bags and boxes, most likely all his worldly possessions. I'm not sure if he worked, but at his age I don't think he could if he wanted to. The next was this young mid-20s woman. Now you can say I'm sexist, but I was quite surprised to see her out there. She was not bad looking. She was young, dark hair, dark eyes, seemed very perky, even for her situation. Again, not trying to be sexist, but I assumed she would have some options. Maybe friends, lovers, distant family members, someone who would take sympathy on her. But then again, I owned my own home and I was in the same boat. Now for the man of the hour, Paul. Paul was always parked in the spot in front of me. He was a late 20s, well-fit, very kind man who was living out of a pretty nice Honda. I actually got to know him a lot by sheer coincidence. See, one day there was a loud argument between a man and a woman. I don't remember what they were arguing about, but I remember the man grabbed her and was trying to force her into his car. I quickly ran over, not knowing that Paul was right behind me. The man saw 2 men running at him and hurried up and sped off. We both comforted the woman and stayed with her until her sister picked her up. As Paul and I began to walk back to our cars, we began to talk. One thing led to another and Paul explained his situation. Paul sadly lost his job some time ago and ended up in serious debt. He did his best looking for a job, but he said it took him over 3 months to find one, and by that time he had his utilities shut off, an eviction notice, and was in extreme debt. When he finally got a job, he had to spend his whole first check just to keep his car from being repoed. Now he lives out of his car while he chips away at his debt and saves enough for a new place. He even noted that he needed to save up triple for a down deposit due to his bad credit. To be honest, his situation did not sound that bad. In his own words, he said he would be having a place in 3 to 4 months. However, that's how long I thought my stay in the Bay Area would be, and we were both wrong. It was October, and the cold really started to make it difficult to sleep in my hatchback. I already had problems sleeping as it was. It shames me to tell people this, but I suffer from hypervigilance. If you remember from episode 1, I explained I'm a Marine Corps combat vet, and due to my service, any small noises or movement jolts me out of bed. Now, where I know you'll judge me, the only thing that seems to help is keeping a pistol in arm's reach. I don't know why, but when I'm shocked awake, just touching the firearm seems to calm my nerves and allow me to fall back asleep. Before this, as soon as I was awake, I was up all day. It was like somebody threw cold water on me, and I had no choice but to start my day. I'm only telling you guys this so you understand that I struggled sleeping in my car because I couldn't keep my pistol next to me, and how many nights I spent awake. California already has strict gun laws as it is, but me jumping up with a gun in my hand when a cop knocks on my window would most likely send me to sleep forever. I did keep my pistol in a locked Pelican case in the back of my hatchback. But also, to answer everybody's questions, yes, I've tried everything, from sleep aid to PM medicine to melatonin to even prescribed sleeping pills from the VA. No matter how groggy or strong the medication was, any noise or movement would still wake me up. Now back to Paul. You could tell he's been doing this for a while. He had panels in every window of his Honda. I assumed it blocked out light and kept people from looking in. I thought about doing it myself, but I kept telling myself it was temporary. But of course I was wrong. One particular cold night, I was so cold and tired that I had to figure out some way to get warm without running my car for 4 hours and killing my battery. A few times I laid down the back seat and laid halfway in the hatchback and halfway on the laid down seats. What didn't work about this is the streetlight would shine directly into my face. So I decided one night to lay knees up in the back of the hatchback and almost close the seat. What was great about this is there was a hard space there above me that helped stop the light from shining in and also would allow people not to see me. It did hurt my knees, and the Pelican case did stab my side, but for the first time I truly fell asleep. This became my new routine. I would lay in the back seat for a while, struggle to sleep, then lay in the hatchback and close up the seat. Little did I know this served more of an important purpose. It most likely saved my life. It was a normal night like any other. I was cozied up in the back of my hatchback, the dark making it easier to sleep. Everything was going as usual, until a surprising noise gripped me from my slumber. The sound was of knocking. When I first came to, I thought about lowering the seat and seeing who was tapping on my car. But my brain assumed it was a cop wanting me to move, which is something I've been dreading for a long while, as I did not want to start driving to different 24-hour spots every night again. So, instead of answering the strange sound, I remained still and quiet until it went away. When things fell silent, I breathed a sigh of relief and began to close my eyes once again, until knocking returned, but now coming from a distance. Again, the only thing I could think is that some police officer was going car to car asking people to move. After a few moments, it fell silent again, which only lasted moments until I heard what sounded like a car door opening, followed by a large crunching noise. Now, along with my sleeping problems, I do have hearing loss and tinnitus, so my hearing is not 100%, but I did hear what sounded like someone stepping on aluminum cans. I still remember laying quiet and still, until there was no more noises. I thought I heard a car door shut again, but it was too faint to make it out. Eventually, after things remained quiet for long enough, I was able to fall asleep once again. The next morning, I started my normal routine of washing up with wet wipes and brushing my teeth. I noticed Paul's car was gone. The only reason I even noticed was because he works. The next morning, I began my normal routine of washing up with wet wipes and brushing my teeth. I noticed that Paul's car was gone. The only reason I even noticed is because he works in the afternoon and I'm usually gone before him. I really did not give it a second thought, as he's a grown man and can go anywhere at any time. But what ended up being a second thought became a reoccurring one in the next few weeks. See, Paul never returned to his spot. I obviously thought it was weird, but I was optimistic to believe that he finally got a new place. But yet, there was something else a little more particular. I began to notice that the old man was never at his car. The first few days, I thought maybe he was working at night, or maybe there's something wrong with his car. I was hoping that he was staying at a family member's house, but that doesn't make sense, as he would have been staying there sooner rather than sleeping in his car. As my thoughts wandered, a tow truck pulled up exactly to where I was looking. As they began to back up to the 90s car full of personal items, I quickly rushed to the truck and began to yell at them to stop. The man driving the tow truck stepped out and asked if it was my car. I said no and explained it belonged to an old man who was sure to return. The man in the tow truck became impatient with me and said that security reported the car has not moved in 2 weeks and needed to be removed. I begged the man to please leave it for a few days, as the old man was to return and everything he owned was in the car. The man begrudgingly agreed and said that he'd be back in 2 days. I breathed a sigh of relief and watched the tow truck leave the parking lot. I decided to take a closer look at the old man's car and see if there was any sign of what happened to him. Maybe he left a note on the windshield or something. As I approached the car, I became more puzzled. The first thing I noticed was the visible dust engulfing the window. The second was the door. It was cracked slightly open. I reached down and pulled with little force, and the door swung free. As odd as that was, I noticed a small dark stain running down his already dark pleather interior driver's seat. I could not make out what it was, but my attention was quickly drawn to a familiar car pulling a few spaces down. I shut the squeaky old man's car door and began to walk over to the nicer looking Honda. Paul quickly jumped out of his car and at a good pace came up to me and very strangely gave me a hug. When I say strangely, Paul and I never even shook hands before, let alone this tight hug he was giving me. "Dude, I thought you were." Paul paused and spoke again. "I'm glad to see you." Paul finished, finally releasing me from his hug. "Yeah, hey man, where you been? I thought you might have finally found your own place," I said, stepping away, giving us a little bit more space. "Yeah, no, He paused again, quickly shuffling his words. "Yeah, I just needed a change of scenery," he replied. I could tell Paul was acting strange, but we were not close enough for me to pry. But at the same time, we were not close enough to hug. But that happened. Paul looked over at the old man's car, and his face began to change. "Have you seen the old guy?" Paul asked. "No, they just tried to tow his car. I guess he hasn't been here for a few weeks," I replied. Paul's head began to sink, and his demeanor began to change. He looked that of a sad child, and he put his hands in his pockets and began to lean against his car. "Paul, I don't mean to, I paused, trying to figure out what I wanted to ask. "Are you okay, man? Is something going on?" I asked. "I don't know. Yes, no," Paul said, now with his hands on his head. Paul let out a loud hum as he began to rub his hands against his eyes. "Dude, look, whatever is going on, maybe I can help," I said, as I fixated on Paul's nervous arm movement. Paul sighed deep and stared into the distance. "Alright, I guess you need to know, or else you could be next," Paul said while never making eye contact. "Look, believe me or not is up to you, but I've seen this before," Paul said while rocking back and forth and still not making eye contact. Paul looked at me. I said sternly, "Whatever is going on, you need to tell me." Paul's eyes darted back and forth, trying not to make eye contact. "Alright, man, so I used to park at this church parking lot downtown. It was before the city demanded that all churches kick out anyone who sleeps in their car lots," Paul said with annoyance in his voice. "There was this woman who also stayed there. Tanya was her name. She was a sweet and kind woman who just had some bad luck." Paul paused, moving his arms around as if he was trying to figure out what to do with them. "One night, I heard the knocking in the distance. I didn't really think anything of it until I heard Tanya's car door open." Paul's tone began to change as he continued the story. I just peeked up for a second and I saw some large guy eating her. As Paul said this, he threw his hands in the air and shook his head. He was eating her? I asked, not understanding what Paul was trying to tell me. Yeah, man, like he had her mouth covered in his large hands and was taking large bites of her neck, like half of her neck was gone, Paul said, pointing at his neck. And I was so scared, so I jumped in the back seat and lay down on the floor and I covered my body up with a blanket. Paul now sits on the hood of his Honda with both hands on his face. What happened to Tanya, Paul? I asked, my heart still racing. She was gone. I laid on the ground until the sun came up and I just jumped in my seat and sped off. But I came back like 2 days later and her car was still there, but she was gone, man. She was gone. I called the police, but they did nothing. They just towed her car away. Paul finished his story, quickly pulling out a pack of cigarettes and lighting up a cigarette and taking a drag. His breath smelled of menthols. It never stayed too quiet as I was trying to process Paul's story, because he just kept saying, I know, man, I know, over and over. Do you think that's what happened to the old man? I asked Paul, with my heart still racing from his story. Yes, Paul said, shaking his head aggressively. You heard the knocking, didn't you? He asked me. I did, but I was in my hatchback with the seat up, so I didn't see anything, I replied, feeling embarrassed of what I just said. Paul's face lit up like he finally figured out a complex problem. I knew I heard that thing knocking on your car. I wondered how he didn't get you, Paul said excitingly. You can't let him see you, Paul stopped himself. Well, I think so. That's why my windows are covered. He knocked on my car too, but he couldn't see me. Paul finished as he lit up another cigarette. At that moment, my brain was processing a lot. The big thing was trying to gauge if I believed Paul. His mannerisms and how he was acting is out of character. I wondered if he was on something, or maybe he was actually crazy. I stopped these thoughts, and I thought about some of the crazy things that's happened to me and people I've known. If I was to tell him any of those stories, he would probably think I was crazy too. Paul finished his second cigarette by the time I finished my thoughts. Hey, I'm actually going to stay with some friends, Paul said, with his tone finally mellowing out. I begged him to let me stay. I'm going to give them some of my savings, but it's better than this, Paul said with a smile on his face. Yeah, that makes sense, I replied. Paul looked at me, nodded his head, and began to enter his car. As he turned over the engine, he rolled down his window and yelled, Go home, man. He then sped off, and I never saw him again. Now, although it took me a while to stop thinking about his story, life kind of just continued. The old man's car got towed. I continued to sleep in my hatchback, and the days turned to weeks, then months. I was off for quite a while for the holiday season, and it was my first week back to work. Everything was pretty much the same, until the night that still haunts me happened. I want to start this by saying I believe myself to be a man of action. When faced with life or death situations, I've always marched into the unknown and made it back. But this night caused me to react in a way I'm still perplexed about to this day. The night was still. The cold air caused me to double up on blankets as my knees compressed together so I can fit in the small compartment in my vehicle. I remember waking up slowly, not fast like my usual alertness. I remember feeling a presence. It's really hard to explain, but something in my body knew there was someone or something outside of my car. It felt like a weird sense I've never felt, like I knew I was prey for whatever was out there. I heard the knock in the distance, and my heart began to sink. My breath became shallow, and I froze completely. The same noise I heard the other night came back like a song on repeat. There was a faint car door opening, and the sounds of cans being crushed. I fought every instinct in my body and slowly opened the back seat and peeked through the window. Instantly, I felt my lungs pause as the horror registered in my brain. There across from my car was a familiar young woman's face flopped sideways, dark eyes glazed over, and a large man-like creature hunched over her. I could make out the large missing flesh from her neck. Red tendons and muscles shimmered in the street light. It really looked like some wild animal took half of her neck. But the thing that was more strange was the lack of blood. I had a friend in the service get shot in the neck, and one thing that never stopped, no matter how hard you tried, was the blood. But with this now dead woman, her neck torn open, barely had any blood. As my breath returned, I slowly began to close the seat and make my way back into the car. As I'm doing this, my heart yet again stopped with absolute fear. I noticed that as I was looking at the woman's face, right above hers, peering right at me, was a large, pale man whose face was covered with the missing blood. I began to move quicker and shut the seat and sat as still as I could. I thought about getting my firearm, but I was completely paralyzed with fear, like I've never been before. The world began to quiet, and the only thing I could hear is the ringing in my ears. For a moment, I began to calm, as I thought the creature may have gone, till I heard it, a knocking on my car. I panicked, and goosebumps danced back and forth on my full body, my heart beating faster than it ever has. Again, I hear the knock, knock, followed by silence. I grew quiet once more, but I did not let my guard down. But one last thing broke the silence and has scared me for the rest of my life. A voice I could only explain as being both high and low at the same time says, "I know you're in there." The rest of the night remained quiet, but every second felt like hours. I held my breath for what felt like an eternity, and my heart never ceased. I waited till the light shined through the cracks, and I jumped in the front seat of my car and drove off. I told my job that I was done and demanded to go back down south. They agreed, and they said I'd be home in a few weeks. I spent that time in hotels, with a gun in my hand, barely sleeping. I did finally get to go home. I did some research, and I know this is going to sound crazy, but San Francisco has this whole vampire underground kind of thing. I'm not saying that that monster was a vampire, but I'm saying that maybe that's where the stories come from. I really don't know. I just know that over 40,000 people go missing in California a year. That's not counting the homeless who don't get reported. If I was a monster who needed to eat people, San Francisco would be the perfect place. To be honest, this is weird even talking about, but there's one thing I can truly say is I am haunted by those words. I know you're in there.